From the outside, Ferrari's home race looked respectable. Both cars in the top 5, Hamilton clawing back from a grid penalty, Leclerc pushing to stay within 25 seconds of the McLarens. But inside the engineering trucks parked behind the paddock, the picture was far less flattering. The sector data was merciless. In Monza's Lesmo 1, Hamilton's minimum corner speed dropped to 187 km per hour, while Norris, in the McLaren, carried 195. 8 km per hour may not sound catastrophic, but stretched across 53 laps, it translated to nearly 22 seconds lost. And that was before tyre degradation magnified the deficit. The root cause wasn't driver execution. Hamilton's steering traces showed he was smoother than Leclerc on turn-in, bleeding less lateral load through the tyres. Yet the SF25's aero balance shifted unpredictably every time the fuel load dropped below 80 kilograms. In practice, that meant the rear wouldn't stay planted in medium-speed entries, forcing both drivers to compensate by lifting earlier than their rivals. Ferrari's attempt to run an aggressive rear suspension geometry, intended to generate more rotation in the slow corners, instead destabilized the car everywhere else. What makes this failure more painful is its predictability. Since Zandvoort, the telemetry has been consistent. Ferrari lose between 0.18 and 0.24 seconds in every medium-speed corner compared to Red Bull and McLaren, a pattern that repeated itself relentlessly at Monza. The engineers know the cure, more stable floor dynamics and less aggressive suspension rake, but implementing it mid-season requires an admission Ferrari rarely make, that their design philosophy itself is flawed. And that's exactly where Hamilton's presence becomes seismic. He's not just delivering lap times, he's forcing Ferrari to confront truths the team culture has historically ignored. His calm silence on lap 41 wasn't fatigue, nor resignation. It was the deliberate act of a driver trained at Mercedes, where every deficit was dissected and solved, not buried under rhetoric. The real question now isn't whether Ferrari's SF25 can be salvaged. It's whether Maranello's leadership has the humility to listen to the champion they hired to change their destiny. What unsettled Ferrari most at Monza wasn't the stopwatch, it was Hamilton's silence. For a man who built his reputation on laser-sharp radio calls, requesting strategy tweaks, questioning tyre life down to the percentage, his decision to coast quietly sent a sharper message than any outburst. Silence in Formula One is never neutral. It's either submission or protest, and Hamilton has never been the type to submit. Charles Leclerc's reaction revealed the other half of the paradox. When Hamilton hinted in post-race interviews that Ferrari's problems ran deeper than the SF25's design, Leclerc stood rigid, his answers reduced to platitudes. To the Tifosi, it looked like loyalty, but to those within the paddock, it looked like resignation. Leclerc has carried the emotional burden of Ferrari since 2019, enduring the highs of pole positions and the lows of strategy implosions. His default response has always been stoic defense. But when a 7-time champion places a mirror in front of the Scuderia, even Leclerc's silence became damning. This is where Ferrari's culture becomes its own opponent. Historically, the team oscillates between brilliance and implosion, a cycle familiar to insiders at Maranello. Under Jean Todt and Ross Brawn, Ferrari learned to value process over pride. But since then, the pendulum has swung back toward image management. Strong statements, patriotic declarations, promises of a new dawn. Yet beneath the headlines, the technical foundation has weakened. At Monza, Hamilton's refusal to paper over the cracks signaled that this era of superficial fixes may be ending. The political tension is clear. Leclerc represents continuity, the driver woven into Ferrari's identity, nurtured through their academy. Hamilton represents disruption, the outsider with the authority to demand structural reform. And in Formula One, where perception often drives as much as performance, this philosophical clash is as destabilizing as a botched pit stop. The next question isn't about setup sheets or tyre strategies. It's whether Ferrari can survive two drivers embodying opposite visions of leadership. One anchored in loyalty, the other in transformation. In the raw mathematics of the championship, Ferrari's struggle isn't just about missed podiums, it's about the widening canyon between potential and reality. After Monza, McLaren sit atop the standings with 617 points. Ferrari, despite boasting the strongest driver pairing on paper, languish on 280. That's not a gap, it's a gulf. More than 300 points separating Maranello from their supposed rivals. For context, that's the equivalent of 12 race victories with fastest laps, a deficit almost impossible to close under the current point system. Yet the numbers only tell half the story. Leclerc's fourth place at Monza banked 12 points. Hamilton's fifth added 10. Combined, 22 points sounds respectable, until you compare it with McLaren's 33 from Norris and Piastri. Over a season, that steady drip-feed advantage snowballs into a runaway. Ferrari's internal inefficiencies aren't just costing them wins. They're multiplying McLaren's dominance lap after lap. Hamilton knows this math better than anyone. At Mercedes, he won titles by exploiting fine margins. A 2-second undercut here, a 3-point swing there. Watching Ferrari bleed away points through repeatable, predictable weaknesses must feel like déjà vu, but from the wrong side of the equation. His silence wasn't resignation, it was calculation. If Ferrari won't confront the structural issues, then every lap driven is only inflating the deficit, and that deficit has psychological consequences. Leclerc, once considered Hamilton's heir apparent, is now under the shadow of a teammate whose entire career has been defined by maximising championship opportunities. Every lost point reminds Leclerc that Hamilton came not just to compete, but to transform. If Ferrari continue losing ground, the internal battle for moral authority, who dictates the team's future, will intensify. The irony is brutal. Ferrari hired Hamilton to bring championship DNA back to Maranello. Instead, his presence is highlighting exactly why that DNA no longer exists within the Scuderia. And if the numbers don't change soon, Ferrari won't just lose a championship fight. They'll lose the very identity Hamilton was brought in to restore. At Monza, Ferrari's strategic blueprint looked straightforward. Stretch the first stint, cover the McLarens in clean air, and hope Hamilton's tyre management opened a late race opportunity. On paper, it was logical. In reality, it collapsed under scrutiny. By lap 23, when Hamilton was pushing Leclerc within DRS range, Ferrari's pit wall had a decision. Pit early and undercut George Russell, or extend the stint to preserve track position. They chose the latter. The result? Hamilton rejoined 5 seconds behind Russell after his stop, unable to recover the ground lost during those extra laps on aging mediums. What stings is that Hamilton called it in real time. His post-race admission? In hindsight, we should have tried the undercut. Wasn't criticism. It was a reminder of how these decisions were instinctive at Mercedes. Under Toto Wolff, Hamilton's racecraft and the team's simulations worked in unison. If the numbers suggested an undercut window, the call was immediate. Ferrari, by contrast, hesitated. And in Formula One, hesitation bleeds seconds. Setup choices compounded the error. Ferrari opted for a slightly lower rear ride height to maximise straight-line speed. A logical play at Monza's Temple of Speed. But the trade-off was brutal tyre degradation. Hamilton reported front left graining at just 16 laps, 2 laps earlier than predicted, while Leclerc's onboard showed visible understeer through parabolica. By chasing marginal gains in top speed, Ferrari sabotaged their ability to attack in the corners, where McLaren built their advantage. For Hamilton, this isn't just about missed opportunities, it's about cultural dissonance. At Mercedes, he thrived in an environment where his feedback was trusted and acted upon within laps. At Ferrari, that trust feels diluted by committee-style decision-making. It's a clash of philosophies, one system designed to maximise marginal gains, another burdened by the weight of tradition and fear of mistakes. And that clash is more than technical, it's political. Because each misjudged call gives Hamilton more justification to push for change, and leaves Leclerc defending a structure that no longer defends him. Every paddock veteran knows Ferrari's story is never written solely on track. What happens inside the motorhomes and behind the closed doors of Maranello often dictates outcomes more than lap times. Hamilton's quiet rebuke at Monza immediately triggered whispers that felt hauntingly familiar. To some insiders, it recalled the late 1990s, when Ferrari oscillated between glory and implosion, until Jean Todt and Ross Brawn imposed structure. To others, it felt like the early 2010s, when Fernando Alonso dragged underperforming cars into contention while the Scuderia fractured internally. The political dynamic is eerily similar. Back then, Ferrari's leadership often deflected accountability, leaning on the mythology of the prancing horse, rather than addressing systemic flaws. Now, Hamilton has punctured that mythology by suggesting the problem isn't only mechanical, but cultural. His silence, his post-race serenity, even his refusal to join the podium celebrations despite finishing fifth. All of it reads as a calculated reminder that Ferrari must change or repeat history. Leclerc, by contrast, embodies the Alonso role, the loyal warrior, emotionally tethered to Ferrari's identity, carrying the burden of Tifosi expectations. But Hamilton is playing a different game. At Mercedes, he learned how political power within a team can be as decisive as pole position. His quiet statement wasn't aimed at the fans. It was aimed at Ferrari's technical dome, the decision-makers whose choices ripple through every corner exit and pit call. The danger for Ferrari is that the pattern is obvious to everyone in the paddock. Rival teams smell blood when internal fractures surface. McLaren's engineers joked quietly in the hospitality area that Ferrari were fighting ghosts, not cars. Red Bull, though weaker this year, understand the opportunity when Ferrari turn inward. Formula One history is merciless. Once a team becomes consumed by its own politics, the championship fight is already lost. And that's why Monza matters beyond the score sheet. Hamilton's presence has turned Ferrari's weaknesses into visible fault lines. The Scuderia can no longer pretend this is about setups or bad luck. It's about identity. And in Formula One, identity often determines whether you dominate an era or disappear into it. The question haunting Ferrari now is brutally simple. What comes next? Formula One doesn't allow time for reflection. Within 2 weeks, the championship caravan shifts. Circuits, setups must be recalibrated, and every weakness exposed in Monza will be magnified elsewhere. For Ferrari, the urgency isn't just about finding lap time, it's about deciding what kind of team they want to be with Hamilton inside their walls. Technically, the roadmap is unforgiving. Ferrari's next planned upgrade package includes a revised floor edge and rear suspension geometry designed to stabilize aero balance at medium speeds. If the numbers coming out of Maranello are accurate, the new floor could claw back 2 to 3 tenths per lap. But Hamilton has already hinted that numbers on paper aren't enough. He wants structural reform, faster decision-making, cleaner lines of communication, and a culture that values execution over rhetoric. Without that, even a faster SF25 will remain a flawed weapon. Strategically, the dilemma is deeper. Leclerc still embodies Ferrari's long-term vision, the driver they invested in as a national hero. Yet Hamilton's reputation as a culture shifter threatens to eclipse him. If Ferrari back Hamilton's reformist push, Leclerc risks becoming the quiet passenger in his own team. If they protect Leclerc's role as emotional anchor, Hamilton could retreat from investing his full energy into the project. Either path creates turbulence. Politically, the whispers are already escalating. Some insiders claim Hamilton is positioning himself to influence Ferrari's 2026 car concept, the first built fully under the new regulations. If true, it means his silence at Monza was only the opening gambit in a longer game. But that raises the ultimate question. Will Ferrari empower Hamilton to rebuild their DNA? Or will they recoil into the comfort of pride and tradition? Because in Formula One, delay is defeat. Every indecision, every hesitation, every unaddressed cultural fracture compounds lap time. And if Ferrari don't resolve this crossroads swiftly, they may find that Hamilton hasn't just come to highlight their weaknesses. He's come to force them into decisions they've avoided for decades. For all the engineering graphs and strategic models, Formula One remains a human sport. Nowhere is that truer than Ferrari. The Tifosi do not simply watch. They judge, they demand, they sanctify, and they crucify. At Monza, Hamilton's subtle silence and Leclerc's rigid composure became more than driver behaviours. They became symbols of Ferrari's split identity, played out under the gaze of hundreds of thousands draped in red. The contrast couldn't be sharper. Hamilton, an outsider in scarlet, stood calm and deliberate, using his reputation to question the very culture he joined. Leclerc, the homegrown hero, looked paralysed, caught between defending the badge he's sworn loyalty to and acknowledging the cracks Hamilton had just exposed. For the Tifosi, the split was unsettling. Some saw Hamilton as the saviour, the champion who dares to tell Ferrari the truth. Others feared his critique was betrayal, undermining the institution that defines Italian motorsport. The media, predictably, poured fuel on the fire. Headlines in Milan screamed about a Ferrari civil war. Paddock pundits compared Hamilton's calm critique to Niki Lauda's famous insistence on brutal honesty in the 1970s. The question reverberating through Italian television studios wasn't whether Ferrari could fight McLaren. It was whether Ferrari could survive its own drivers pulling in opposite directions. This is where the emotional burden lands hardest on Leclerc. For years, he has been Ferrari's emotional anchor, carrying the Tifosi's hopes with stoic grace. But Hamilton's arrival has shifted the ground beneath him. When the seven-time champion questions Ferrari's culture, silence from Leclerc no longer reads as loyalty, it reads as complicity. The Monegasque may not intend it, but in the ruthless theatre of Formula One, perception is everything. And so Ferrari stand exposed, not only in lap times, but in human terms. Two drivers, two philosophies, one team pulled taut between past and future. The tension isn't theoretical anymore. It's written on the faces of their drivers, broadcast in silence, amplified by tifosi chants. The next step Ferrari take, or fail to take, will decide whether this fracture becomes their rebirth or their unravelling. Ferrari's Italian Grand Prix of 2025 will not be remembered for lap charts or pit stop deltas. It will be remembered for what wasn't said. Hamilton's silence on lap 41, his refusal to hide behind convenient excuses, and his subtle suggestion that Ferrari's greatest enemy may lie within its own walls. These moments matter more than sector times. They reveal the truth that every championship team eventually confronts. Speed alone is never enough. Culture decides whether brilliance becomes dynasty or dissolves into frustration. In Hamilton, Ferrari hired more than a driver. They hired a catalyst. His very presence has exposed what many feared, that Ferrari's DNA, unrefined and unchallenged, has calcified into tradition at the expense of progress. In Leclerc, they retain loyalty, a driver who has carried their hopes with dignity. Yet loyalty without transformation risks becoming resignation. The tension between Hamilton's demand for change and Leclerc's instinct for continuity is no longer a subplot. It is the storyline. And this raises the defining dilemma. Is Hamilton building Ferrari's salvation from within, or is he detonating the foundations in search of something new? Should Leclerc double down on defending Ferrari's heritage, or break his silence and align with Hamilton's push for reform? Formula One history offers no easy answer. Teams that ignored their internal critics have collapsed. Teams that embraced uncomfortable truths have built dynasties. Ferrari now stand at that very crossroads. So I'll leave you with this question. Is Ferrari brave enough to let Hamilton reshape them? Or will pride keep them chained to the cycle of glorious failure? And if you think this is the end of the story, it isn't. Because the real battle begins not with Monza, but with Ferrari's 2026 project. The car that will either embody Hamilton's vision or prove Leclerc right to stay silent.